The humid, oppressive heat of an Arkansas summer had settled over the small, sleepy town of Havenwood like a suffocating blanket on that Tuesday, the 10th of July, 2007. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, hung heavy and still, promising a relentless afternoon. 10-year-old Sophia Evans, a girl with a constellation of freckles across her nose and eyes the color of summer moss, had left her modest, pastel blue home at precisely 11:43 a.m., her bright yellow bicycle a streak of defiant sunshine against the muted tones of the residential street. Her mission, a small but important rite of passage for many Havenwood children, was to ride to the town's single, bustling general store, just 7 blocks away, to buy a gallon of milk and her grandmother's favorite brand of vanilla ice cream. Sophia's mother, Eleanor, a woman whose days revolved around her only child, had watched her go from the front porch swing, a faint smile playing on her lips as Sophia waved cheerfully before disappearing around the bend of Maple Avenue. "Be careful, sweetie," Eleanor had called out, a familiar maternal caution that echoed through the quiet, tree-lined street. "And don't talk to strangers." Sophia, her small frame already propelled by the momentum of her journey, had responded with a faint "I won't" carried back on the still air, a promise made with the boundless, unshakable confidence of childhood. In Havenwood, a town of barely 3,000 souls nestled beside the gently flowing Saline River, such concerns were almost ritualistic, echoes of a larger, more dangerous world that rarely intruded upon their insular peace. Here, unlocked doors were common, children played freely in the streets until dusk, and the greatest drama usually involved a lost pet or a particularly competitive church bake-off. The general store, an old brick building with a creaky wooden porch and a bell that jingled merrily upon entry, was a hub of community life, a place where everyone knew everyone, and a child running an errand was a common, reassuring sight. No shadows of impending doom, no premonitions of shattering grief dared to cloud the bright, optimistic morning for Sophia Evans or her mother. Eleanor had retreated inside, the rhythmic whir of her washing machine, a comforting domestic sound, her thoughts drifting to the simple pleasures of the afternoon, a cool glass of iced tea, a quiet read on the porch, and the delightful prospect of vanilla ice cream with Sophia after their customary afternoon walk to the local park. The clock on the kitchen wall, a simple wooden piece carved with a sunflower, marked 11:50 a.m. The air, thick and humid, hinted at the glorious warmth the day promised. A perfect day for a child to embark on a small, independent adventure. This idyllic morning, however, was destined to become the precipice of an unimaginable tragedy, a turning point that would forever scar the landscape of their lives and cast a long, cold shadow over the quiet community of Havenwood. An unseen malevolence, a patient and calculated darkness, lurked, poised to shatter that fragile illusion and plunge Havenwood into an abyss of fear, suspicion, and an enduring, heartbreaking mystery. Sophia, oblivious to the grim fate awaiting her, pedaled with youthful exuberance, her bright yellow bicycle a vivid splash of color against the backdrop of green trees and neatly trimmed lawns. She hummed a tune, a small mind filled with the simple joys of her errand, the clinking coins in her pocket, the cool, delicious promise of ice cream, and the satisfying sense of accomplishment that came with completing a grown-up task. The gentle curves of the road, the familiar faces of neighbors tending their gardens, the comforting drone of cicadas, all spoke of safety, of routine, of a world in perfect order. But on this particular Tuesday, an unseen predator, a wolf in sheep's clothing, had slipped into the folds of Havenwood's complacency. At precisely 12:03 p.m., Sophia Evans, nearing the midpoint of her journey, turned left onto Elm Street, a quieter, less trafficked route often favored by children for its shade and lack of speeding cars. She was just 3 blocks from the general store, the tantalizing aroma of fresh-baked bread already wafting faintly on the humid air. The last confirmed sighting of Sophia was made by an elderly couple, the Millers, pruning roses in their front yard on Elm Street. They saw her pedal past, a flash of yellow and a cascade of dark brown hair, her face bright with youthful determination. They exchanged a fond glance, remarking on the innocence of Havenwood, before returning to their roses, completely unaware that they were witnessing the final precious moments of Sophia Evans's freedom. After Sophia passed their house, Elm Street curved gently, becoming momentarily obscured by a dense thicket of overgrown honeysuckle and towering oak trees, before opening up again to reveal the general store's parking lot. In that short, shaded stretch, a segment of road approximately 50 yards long, Sophia Evans, her bright yellow bicycle, her gallon of milk, and her grandmother's vanilla ice cream vanished without a trace, swallowed whole by the seemingly innocuous summer day. No screams were heard, no struggle witnessed. The only thing left behind, a crucial, minute detail that would later define the 25-year investigation, was a single, tiny, almost invisible white button, adorned with a delicate, embossed floral pattern, lying innocently on the cracked pavement where Elm Street disappeared behind the honeysuckle. It was as if the heat itself had simply absorbed her, leaving nothing but an echoing silence and a mother's escalating, unbearable fear. The clock on Eleanor's kitchen wall continued to tick, marking the passage of time with an indifference that felt cruel, each second deepening the chasm of their despair. The tranquil veneer of Havenwood was about to be ripped away, revealing the raw, exposed nerves of a community grappling with the unthinkable. The date, July 10th, 2007, would forever be etched into the collective memory of the town, not as a day of warmth and sunshine, but as the day Sophia Evans disappeared, swallowed whole by the oppressive summer air, leaving behind only an echoing silence and a community's profound, enduring terror. The first tremor of unease rippled through Eleanor Evans at 12:45 p.m. when Sophia had still not returned. Her internal clock, finely tuned to the rhythms of her child's life, registered a discordant note. Sophia was never late. Never. Eleanor, her brow furrowed with a nascent worry, called the general store. The store clerk, a friendly woman named Betty, confirmed Sophia had never arrived. The innocent errand had turned into a terrifying void. Eleanor's heart began to thud against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She immediately called her husband, David, a steady, pragmatic man who worked as a logger just outside of town. His voice, usually calm, acquired a sharp edge of concern as Eleanor, her own voice beginning to tremble, relayed the chilling news. By 1:15 p.m., the initial frantic search had begun. Eleanor and David, their faces pale and drawn, walked and drove the short route Sophia should have taken, calling her name, their voices rising in pitch with each unanswered cry. They checked every yard, every porch, every familiar hiding spot. The bright yellow bicycle, usually a beacon of Sophia's presence, was nowhere to be found. The silence of the humid afternoon, once peaceful, now seemed heavy, oppressive, a thick blanket woven from unspoken fears. The small white floral button, lying innocently on the cracked pavement of Elm Street, remained unseen, a silent, eloquent witness to the horror that had just unfolded. At precisely 1:40 p.m., Eleanor Evans made the agonizing call to the Havenwood Sheriff's Department. Sheriff John Caldwell, a man whose tenure had been marked by little more than minor traffic infractions and the occasional lost dog, received the call, his initial reaction one of reassuring dismissal. "Children wander off all the time, Mrs. Evans. She'll turn up." But Eleanor's quiet, insistent panic, the precise timestamp of Sophia's departure, and the utter lack of any trace finally registered with Caldwell. Deputy Earl Thomas, another instance of recurring names in the vast canvas of law enforcement, a subtle echo of the larger interconnected world of crime. A young, ambitious officer who had recently transferred from a larger city force was dispatched to the Evans residence. Upon arriving and seeing the raw, palpable terror in Eleanor's eyes and David's grim silence, Thomas immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He initiated a rapid, localized search, mobilizing the sparse resources of the Havenwood department and calling in local volunteers. The community, initially responding with neighborly concern, quickly shifted to a chilling realization as the afternoon wore on without any sign of Sophia. The small, close-knit town, which had always prided itself on its safety, began to feel a cold, creeping sense of dread. By 5:00 p.m., with the sun beginning its slow descent towards the western horizon, casting long, distorted shadows, the Havenwood Sheriff's Department formally contacted the Arkansas State Police, ASP, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, signaling the transition from a missing child case to a potential abduction. Special Agent Mark Peterson, a veteran FBI agent from the Little Rock Field Office with a reputation for meticulousness and an unnerving ability to read a crime scene, was assigned as the lead investigator. He arrived in Havenwood just after 7:30 p.m., the flashing blue lights of his unmarked sedan cutting through the deepening gloom, casting eerie, fleeting shadows on the anxious faces gathered at the Evans home. Peterson, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes, and a perpetually rumpled suit, took in the scene with a practiced gaze. He spoke to Sheriff Caldwell and Deputy Thomas, absorbing the limited details, then sought out Eleanor and David Evans, his voice calm and empathetic, yet firm. "Tell me everything," he requested, his pen poised over a small notepad. Eleanor, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from weeping, recounted the morning's events with heartbreaking precision, her memory sharpened by terror. David, his jaw tight, described Sophia's personality, her routine, her cautious nature, completely at odds with simply wandering off. As they spoke, Peterson's mind began to construct a timeline, a mental map of probabilities and impossibilities. The lack of any trace, no bicycle, no struggle, no witnesses in the crucial 50-yard stretch of Elm Street immediately raised a red flag. This was not a case of a child getting lost. This was something far more insidious. The FBI initiated a full-scale search operation, bringing in dozens of trained personnel, K-9 units, and specialized equipment. The residential streets, the nearby woods, the banks of the Saline River, every abandoned building, and every culvert were meticulously scoured. The once quiet Evans home became the epicenter of a frantic, round-the-clock investigation, illuminated by floodlights that cast a harsh, artificial glare over the desperate activity. Helicopters with powerful searchlights sliced through the night sky, their rhythmic thud a somber soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. Local and national news crews, alerted by the unusual activity, began to converge on Havenwood, their satellite trucks and reporters with grave expressions transforming the pastoral setting into a media spectacle. The story of Sophia Evans, so innocent, so young, began to spread like wildfire across the state, then the nation, touching hearts and igniting a collective sense of horror. The fear within Havenwood was palpable. Doors that had always been left unlocked were now bolted. Parents clutched their children tighter, their eyes scanning every shadow, every unfamiliar vehicle that passed through town. The comforting blanket of safety had been violently ripped away, replaced by the chilling realization that evil, silent and unseen, could penetrate even the most idyllic of communities. As the hours stretched into the grim reality of a full 24-hour period since Sophia's disappearance, hope, a fragile thing, began to fray at the edges. Agent Peterson, reviewing the initial findings with Sheriff Caldwell, could find no tangible leads. No witnesses saw anything unusual. No strange vehicles were reported. The only thing they had was the devastating absence of one young life. The profound silence of the small town, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock them, holding its terrible secrets close. The sun rose again on Wednesday, July 11th, 2007, but its light brought no comfort, only the stark illumination of their failure. The search continued, relentless and methodical, but with each passing hour, the dreadful certainty grew. Sophia Evans was not merely lost, she had been taken. The initial investigative efforts, hampered by the suddenness of the event and the overwhelming emotional impact on the community, would soon transition into a long, arduous cold case, a monument to loss that would haunt generations of law enforcement and forever cast a shadow over the quiet streets of Havenwood. The small white floral button, still lying on the cracked pavement of Elm Street, remained unnoticed for another excruciating 36 hours, until a diligent FBI evidence technician conducting a secondary sweep finally spotted it, a minute, solitary clue destined to hold a quarter-century of unspoken truths. The disappearance of Sophia Evans became a gaping wound in the heart of Havenwood, a tragedy that irrevocably altered the town's innocent perception of itself. The initial furious tempo of the FBI-led investigation, orchestrated by Special Agent Mark Peterson, gradually decelerated, not due to a lack of effort, but due to an overwhelming absence of meaningful leads. Every conceivable investigative avenue was exhausted in the days and weeks following July 10, 2007. A thorough grid search of the entire town and its immediate surrounding areas, including the dense woods bordering the Saline River, was conducted. K-9 units, their sensitive noses trained on Sophia's scent, meticulously combed every alley, every culvert, every abandoned building, but yielded no definitive results beyond the initial area of Elm Street. The Saline River, a tranquil ribbon of water that flowed nearby, was dragged by divers, its shallow depths scrutinized for any sign of the missing girl or her bright yellow bicycle. The bicycle itself, a crucial piece of evidence, remained stubbornly missing, a baffling absence that compounded the mystery. The one tangible piece of physical evidence, the small white floral button, Exhibit E27, discovered by the diligent FBI technician 36 hours after Sophia vanished, became the focal point of the nascent forensic investigation. It was a common, mass-produced button, likely from a shirt or blouse, but its presence at the exact spot Sophia disappeared, coupled with no other discernible trace, marked it as undeniably significant. Forensic analysis of the button in 2000 2007, using the technology of the time, yielded limited results. Microscopic examination identified the material as plastic composite, and while minute traces of dirt and a few generic textile fibers were found clinging to its surface, none were unique enough to generate a specific lead. The button offered no DNA evidence. Agent Peterson, a man hardened by years of confronting human depravity, found himself haunted by Sophia's smiling face on the missing posters that now papered every telephone pole and storefront in Havenwood. He understood, with a profound sense of foreboding, that without more physical evidence, without a witness, without a confession, this case could very easily slip into the labyrinthine shadows of the unsolved. The FBI established a national tip line, and thousands of calls poured in, each one meticulously logged and investigated. Sightings, both credible and fantastical, were reported from across Arkansas and neighboring states. A yellow bicycle was spotted in Hot Springs. A girl resembling Sophia was seen at a rest stop in Oklahoma. Each lead, no matter how tenuous, was pursued with grim determination, often leading to dead ends, mistaken identities, or cruel hoaxes. The emotional toll on the investigators was immense, particularly for Deputy Earl Thomas, who, as a young father himself, internalized the sheer terror of Sophia's disappearance. The first week transitioned into the second, then the third, and the relentless media attention, once a torrent, began to ebb, replaced by other headlines, other tragedies. For Eleanor and David Evans, however, the nightmare only intensified. Their modest home, once filled with Sophia's laughter, became a mausoleum of unbearable silence. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the unwatched cartoons, the untouched toys, each was a searing reminder of their unbearable loss. Eleanor found herself constantly searching, her eyes scanning the horizon, convinced that any moment she would see Sophia pedal up the street, her bright yellow bicycle a beacon of her return. David, a man who had always found solace in physical labor, began to wander their property aimlessly, his gaze vacant, his shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. The community, initially united in its support, began to splinter under the strain of prolonged uncertainty. Whispers started, fueled by fear and suspicion. Was it an outsider? Was it someone local, someone hidden? In plain sight, paranoia settled over Havenwood like a suffocating fog. Neighbors looked at each other with newly guarded eyes. Children were no longer allowed to play unsupervised, their carefree days replaced by the watchful gaze of anxious parents. The innocence of the town, once its defining characteristic, had been irrevocably shattered. Agent Peterson, despite the dwindling leads, refused to categorize the Sophia Evans case as cold. He held daily briefings, reviewing every piece of information, every interview, every discarded theory. He knew that the perpetrator, if still at large, was likely observing, perhaps even participating, in the community's grief, a chilling thought that underscored the depravity inherent in such crimes. The absence of a ransom note, the lack of any communication from a presumed abductor, suggested a motive far darker than financial gain. This was a crime of opportunity, a snatch and grab from the very heart of a family, leaving behind only grief and an unanswerable question. The sun continued to rise and set over Havenwood, marking the relentless passage of time, each day adding another layer of dust to the growing pile of unanswered prayers. The missing persons posters, once vibrant with the hope of return, began to fade in the sun and rain, their edges curling, their messages growing fainter, mirroring the fading hope in the hearts of Eleanor and David Evans. July turned into August, August into September, and the stifling heat of the Arkansas summer gave way to the crisp air of autumn. Sophia's 11th birthday passed, a poignant, unbearable marker of her absence. December brought the holidays, a cruel juxtaposition of joy and profound sorrow. 2007 gave way to 2008. And then to the new decade. Eleanor and David Evans, their youth stolen by grief, aged visibly, their laughter replaced by a quiet, pervasive sorrow. They never moved from their home, a perpetual shrine to their lost daughter, forever waiting, forever hoping for a miracle that refused to materialize. The small, floral button, stored in an evidence locker in Little Rock, Arkansas, became a silent monument to the inexplicable. The case, though never officially closed, entered the somber realm of the cold case file, a thick binder filled with interviews, photographs, and the haunting specter of one lost child. The image of Sophia Evans, smiling brightly in a faded photograph, would become a universal symbol of enduring parental grief, a constant reminder of the day Havenwood lost its innocence and a family lost its very reason for being. The passage of time, which heals some wounds, only deepened the chasm of their loss, turning it into a monument of sorrow, ensuring that the cold case of Sophia Evans remained one of Arkansas's most enduring and heartbreaking mysteries for a very long time. 17 years, a span of time that transformed a child into an adult, a blink in the vastness of history, yet an agonizing eternity for Eleanor and David Evans. Sophia, if she were alive, would now be 27, her freckled nose and moss-green eyes likely softened by maturity, her boundless confidence tempered by the experiences of adulthood. The hope, once a fierce, burning flame, had dwindled to a persistent, flickering ember, meticulously tended by Eleanor's unwavering maternal love and David's quiet, steadfast devotion. Eleanor, her once vibrant spirit subdued by an enduring sorrow, maintained a perpetual vigil, her gaze often distant, haunted by the ghost of her missing daughter. David, his strong frame slightly stooped, continued his logging work, finding a grim solace in the physical demands of the forest, his silence often more eloquent than words. Their home remained a shrine, every object a poignant reminder of the daughter they had lost. The community of Havenwood, too, had changed. New families had moved in, unaware of the deep scar that ran beneath the town's placid surface. The old general store had been renovated, its creaky wooden porch replaced by a modern, accessible ramp. But for those who remembered, for those who had lived through the harrowing days of July 2007, the memory of Sophia Evans remained a raw, unhealed wound. Sheriff John Caldwell had long since retired, his tenure ending with the bitter taste of an unsolved case. Deputy Earl Thomas, now Sheriff Thomas, carried the weight of Sophia's case like a personal burden. He had been a young father when Sophia vanished, and the helplessness he felt then had fueled a lifelong dedication to law enforcement, a quiet vow to one day bring answers to the Evans family. The cold case file, a voluminous collection of reports, interviews, and outdated forensic analyses, sat in a locked cabinet in his office, a stark reminder of the limitations of 2007 technology. Agent Mark Peterson had retired from the FBI, his distinguished career ending with a litany of solved cases, but the Sophia Evans case remained one of the few that gnawed at his conscience, a persistent whisper of what might have been. However, the world of forensic science had undergone a revolutionary transformation in those 17 years. DNA analysis, once a complex and expensive procedure, had become incredibly sophisticated and significantly more accessible. Trace DNA, even from minute or degraded samples, could now yield full genetic profiles. Genetic genealogy, a technique combining DNA profiling with ancestral tracing, offered unprecedented avenues for identifying unknown suspects and victims, even from minute biological samples, a game-changer for cases long deemed unsolvable. In the spring of 2024, a new cold case initiative at the Arkansas State Police, spearheaded by a fresh-faced, ambitious forensic anthropologist named Dr. Sarah Miller, a poignant, unintentional echo of the past, now a protagonist in a new story, began to systematically review all unsolved abductions and homicides in the state. Dr. Miller, with her sharp intellect and an almost evangelical belief in the power of modern forensics, saw the Sophia Evans case as a prime candidate for re-examination. The sheer brutality of the disappearance, the chilling lack of the bicycle, and the profound community impact made it a compelling subject for a fresh look. She requested the original case file, a dusty, imposing stack of binders and evidence logs, which arrived in her lab in Little Rock, smelling faintly of age and forgotten despair. Dr. Miller began her meticulous review by focusing on the physical evidence recovered during the initial 2007 search. She knew that even the most painstaking forensic efforts of the earlier decade would have overlooked trace evidence that modern techniques could now detect and analyze. The original evidence log detailed several items that had been collected, but her immediate attention was drawn to Exhibit E27, the small white floral button. In 2007, it had been microscopically examined for fibers and dirt. Now, in 2024, armed with advanced touch DNA capabilities, Dr. Miller saw a glimmer of possibility. This, she mused aloud to her intern, holding the tiny sealed bag containing the button, could be our needle in the haystack, even if it seems unlikely. The process of extracting touch DNA from a surface like a plastic button was painstakingly delicate. It involved specialized techniques to lift epithelial cells, skin cells, that might have been deposited by the perpetrator during the brief, violent interaction. For weeks, Dr. Miller and her team worked tirelessly, their focus absolute. Finally, after numerous attempts, they succeeded in extracting a viable, partial nuclear DNA profile. Nuclear DNA, unlike mitochondrial DNA, is highly individual-specific, meaning it can definitively identify an individual. The profile, though minute, was a breakthrough. It belonged to an unknown male. The next step was forensic genetic genealogy. Dr. Miller uploaded the partial DNA profile to public genealogical databases, hoping for a match with individuals who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestral research. It was a long shot, a search through millions of genetic puzzles, but it was their best hope. The initial search yielded several distant matches, individuals who shared a common ancestor with the unknown donor of the DNA. Working backward through family trees, cross-referencing public records, and meticulously constructing genealogical charts, Dr. Miller and her team began to narrow down the potential family lines. It was a slow, deliberate process, like reconstructing a shattered vase, piece by painstaking piece, focusing intently on individuals with strong historical ties to Havenwood and the surrounding counties. After months of tireless work, a specific family line emerged, one that had deep roots in the community. And within that family line, one name began to surface with chilling regularity: David Jenkins. David Jenkins, 61 years old in 2024, was not a stranger to Havenwood. He was, in fact, a familiar face, a man who had lived his entire life in the small town. He'd been a peripheral figure in the original 2007 investigation, briefly interviewed as a local resident who lived on Elm Street and claimed to have seen nothing unusual on the day of Sophia's disappearance. He had even participated in some of the early volunteer searches, offering his assistance with a quiet, unassuming demeanor. He was a pillar of the community, a retired school bus driver, a respected deacon at the local church, a man whose presence at town functions was as predictable as the changing seasons. The very idea that David Jenkins could be connected to such a heinous crime sent a jolt of disbelief through Sheriff Thomas, who had known Jenkins his entire life. The man fit none of the typical profiles of a child abductor. He was friendly, unassuming, a picture of small-town respectability. The irony of the situation, the hidden in plain sight common device of true crime narratives, was almost too bitter to contemplate. Yet the genetic genealogy did not lie. Dr. Miller's team presented their findings to Sheriff Thomas and a team of ASP cold case agents, including a now retired Agent Peterson, who had been brought back in as an advisor. The evidence, though circumstantial at this stage, was compelling. The DNA from the button, Sophia's last known location, pointed directly to David Jenkins's family line. The decision was made to covertly obtain a definitive DNA sample from David Jenkins. Under the guise of a community cleanup drive, free refreshments were offered, and Jenkins, ever the good citizen, participated, discarding a used plastic bottle into a designated trash receptacle. The bottle was immediately collected and rushed to the ASP lab, where Dr. Miller and her team waited with bated breath. The nuclear DNA analysis was performed. The results came back within 72 hours, shattering the 17-year-old silence of the Sophia Evans case with the brutal force of undeniable truth. The nuclear DNA profile from David Jenkins's discarded bottle was a definitive, unambiguous match to the partial DNA profile extracted from the small white floral button found on Elm Street in 2007. The probability of it being anyone else was astronomical, beyond statistical reason. The button, once a dismissed generic item, was now the smoking gun. It meant David Jenkins had been at the scene, exactly where Sophia Evans had disappeared, and given the nature of the crime and the lack of other evidence, it strongly implied his involvement. The news hit Sheriff Thomas with the force of a physical blow. David Jenkins, the man he had known, respected, and shared countless cups of coffee with over the years. The man who had expressed his condolences to Eleanor and David Evans year after year. The quiet school bus driver, the church deacon. The revelation was a profound betrayal, a chilling testament to the banality of evil. The arrest, when it came, would not only shock Havenwood to its core, but would also bring a bittersweet, long-delayed surge of hope for justice to Eleanor and David Evans, who had spent 17 years living in the shadow of an unbearable question. The passage of time, once an enemy, had finally, through the silent eloquence of forensic science, begun to reveal its terrible, hidden truths. The morning of David Jenkins's arrest, July 9, 2024, dawned with a clear, hot sun over Havenwood, a stark contrast to the humid, oppressive air of that fateful July morning 17 years prior. The pecan trees lining Maple Avenue, their leaves shimmering in the early light, cast long, peaceful shadows. But beneath this veneer of rural tranquility, a storm of disbelief and outrage was brewing, poised to erupt. The arrest warrant, meticulously prepared by the ASP and signed by a local judge, was for aggravated kidnapping and felony murder. Sheriff Earl Thomas, his face a mask of grim determination, led the small contingent of ASP agents to David Jenkins's modest, well-maintained home, just 2 blocks down Elm Street from where Sophia Evans had vanished. The house, painted a muted beige with a neatly manicured lawn, seemed to mock the sinister truth that was about to be exposed within its walls. Jenkins, a man now in his late 70s with a receding hairline and a kind, unassuming smile, answered the door in his gardening clothes, a worn polo shirt and khaki shorts, as if expecting a delivery or a friendly neighbor stopping by for a chat. His expression, initially one of pleasant inquiry, quickly morphed into confusion, then a dawning horror, as Sheriff Thomas, his voice devoid of any personal familiarity, read him his Miranda rights. "David Jenkins, you are under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Sophia Evans." The words, delivered with a stark, unyielding finality, seemed to hang in the crisp morning air, shattering the deceptive peace of the street. Jenkins's face went ashen. He mumbled something unintelligible, his eyes darting between Sheriff Thomas and the silent, stone-faced ASP agents. He offered no resistance as he was handcuffed, his hands, once calloused from honest work, now bound by the cold steel of justice. As he was led to the unmarked police vehicle, a neighbor, watering her flowers, paused, her jaw dropping in stunned disbelief at the sight of David Jenkins, the quiet church deacon, being arrested. Within minutes, the news, initially a ripple of whispers, began to spread like wildfire through Havenwood, the small town, which had carried the collective grief of Sophia's disappearance for 17 years, was now reeling from a shock of an entirely different magnitude. David Jenkins. The name resonated with familiarity, with trust, with community. He was the man who had driven their children to school for years. He had brought casseroles to the Evanses in the agonizing weeks after Sophia vanished. He had been a comforting, constant presence, seemingly sharing in their sorrow. The betrayal was profound, a knife plunged into the very heart of their trust. The arrest sent shockwaves far beyond Havenwood, reigniting national interest in the long cold case. News vans, once a familiar sight in the summer of 2007, descended upon the quiet town once more, their satellite dishes pointing skyward, ready to broadcast the sensational developments. Reporters clamored for details, their microphones thrust at stunned residents, many of whom could only shake their heads in disbelief, their voices choked with emotion. Eleanor and David Evans received the news in a phone call from Sheriff Thomas himself. Eleanor, her hand trembling so violently she almost dropped the receiver, listened as Sheriff Thomas, his voice thick with emotion, delivered the words they had waited 17 years to hear. "Mrs. Evans, we have made an arrest in Sophia's case. David Jenkins." A strangled cry escaped Eleanor's lips, a sound of profound relief mingled with an overwhelming, gut-wrenching pain. David, his arm around her, held her close as she wept, tears of sorrow, and finally, a fragile flicker of hope streaming down her face. The news was a bittersweet balm, a confirmation that their long vigil might finally yield answers, but it also reopened the old, unbearable wound of their loss. The initial relief gave way to a harrowing question. Where was their daughter? The search for the truth, for Sophia's remains and her bright yellow bicycle, now began in earnest, focused relentlessly on David Jenkins. David Jenkins, now confined to a sterile interview room at the ASP regional headquarters, initially maintained a steadfast facade of bewildered innocence. He demanded a lawyer, offered protests of his faith, and repeated with a maddening calm that he knew nothing of Sophia Evans's disappearance, claiming the DNA evidence must be a mistake, a contamination, a technical error. Agent Peterson, brought in specifically for his experience in high-stakes interrogations, sat across from him, his demeanor calm, authoritative, and utterly relentless. Peterson did not employ theatrics. He relied on the irrefutable data provided by Dr. Miller and the mounting psychological pressure of Jenkins's own guilt, hidden for 17 years. "Mr. Jenkins," Peterson stated, his voice low and even, "we know you were there. We have your DNA. The DNA from the button found on Elm Street, right where Sophia vanished, belongs to you. We've talked to your neighbors, David. We know about your movements that day. We know you were working in your garden a few doors down. We know you saw Sophia. We know you did this." The sustained pressure, the precise mention of details only the perpetrator could know, such as the specific location of the button and his presence on Elm Street, began to erode Jenkins's composure. The veneer of the respected deacon began to crack, revealing the terrified, isolated predator underneath. The solemn, empathetic tone of the investigators, who focused not on judgment but on the possibility of giving the Evanses closure, slowly wore him down. Jenkins, a man who had internalized his horrific secret for so long, began to exhibit classic signs of confession readiness: shifting eye contact, shallow breathing, and a sudden, profound slump in his posture. He asked for a glass of water, a simple gesture that marked his complete surrender. When he spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of a truth long suppressed, finally forcing its way into the light. He began with a series of vague, self-pitying justifications, portraying the act as a momentary lapse, a terrible mistake, but Peterson expertly steered him back to the undeniable facts, the precise timeline of July 10, 2007. The confession, recorded meticulously, was chilling in its casual brutality. Jenkins admitted that he had been gardening in his front yard when he saw Sophia Evans pedal past. He claimed it was an opportunistic impulse, a sudden dark compulsion that overwhelmed his senses. He called out to her, feigning a need for help with a heavy garden pot. When Sophia, ever the helpful child, paused, he quickly overpowered her, dragging her and her bright yellow bicycle into the dense honeysuckle thicket that bordered his property, a natural, impenetrable curtain that had masked his heinous act from the few neighbors who might have glanced his way. Once inside the thicket, the nature of his horrific crime became brutally clear. He confessed to the subsequent agonizing details of her death, details which, in their tragic finality, could only be shared with the grieving parents in the most controlled and sensitive manner, but which gave the investigators the full, unvarnished truth of that terrible afternoon. He also admitted to disassembling Sophia's bicycle and burying it in separate pieces in the deep, swampy ground behind his property, a detail that finally explained its baffling absence for 17 years. The confession, while confirming the worst of the Evanses' fears, finally provided the one thing they desperately needed, the location of their daughter. Jenkins led the ASP and Sheriff Thomas back to his property, specifically to a long-neglected, overgrown patch of dense brush behind his shed. The weather, which had played such an atmospheric role in the beginning, now provided a somber reflection of the mood. A heavy, oppressive heat, mirroring the weight of the moment, settled over them as the search teams, now armed with the killer's precise directions, worked to excavate the scene. The recovery operation was slow, methodical, and heartbreaking, transforming a piece of David Jenkins's property into a temporary, dignified memorial site. The presence of Sophia's remains, 17 years after her disappearance, delivered the definitive, albeit devastating, closure Eleanor and David had been denied for so long. The fragmented pieces of her bright yellow bicycle were also recovered, rusted and broken, but undeniable proof of Jenkins's confession. The trial of David Jenkins, a somber and highly publicized event, took place 8 months later in the county courthouse, just miles from Havenwood. Eleanor and David Evans sat in the front row every day, their faces etched with the cumulative pain of their ordeal, but now bolstered by a quiet, resolute strength. The prosecution, relying heavily on the definitive DNA evidence provided by Dr. Miller, the meticulous, detailed confession, and the recovered bicycle, presented an overwhelming case. The defense offered a brief, futile argument of diminished capacity and mistaken identity, but the jury, composed of local citizens who had lived with the shadow of the cold case for decades, returned a guilty verdict on all counts after only 2 hours of deliberation. David Jenkins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, a cold, hard, and uncompromising entity, had finally been served, 17 years too late for Sophia Evans, but on time for her parents. The resolution, however, was bittersweet. The pain of their loss remained, a permanent fixture in the Evanses' lives, but the haunting uncertainty, the gnawing question of what happened, had been answered. In the quiet aftermath, Eleanor and David established the Sophia Evans Memorial Fund, dedicated to funding cold case investigations using modern forensic genealogy, ensuring that the tragedy that consumed their lives could serve as a catalyst for hope for other families trapped